Do you believe there are other ways to show intelligence besides IQ? Because in schools, most of the education surrounds what they can do intellectually via the IQ, intellectual quotient. But there are other ways, I believe, and research shows that children can learn. So intelligence is a good place to start, but it's not the only place that you have to look when you're looking at children's abilities and what they can do. When I look at children and how they learn and how they develop, I see other areas that are not touched or targeted that are important to how they process information and how they develop as children. And some of those other areas were linguistic intelligence, not only through mathematical, some spatial, music, body, interpersonal and intrapersonal, how we interact with each other, between each other, and what goes on with us internally. Intuitive learning are the things that you learn that people can't teach you. It's like somehow you intrinsically know. It's not necessarily just reflexes, but it's just you extrapolating, taking the things that you know and using those things to help you figure out the things that you don't know. It's having that gut feeling or that, I don't know, that little je ne sais quoi that people have when they're learning about something and putting things together. So that's another type of interoception learning. And then the emotional intelligence that I was talking about is helping students connect their feelings and emotions with the process of acquiring information. That's important because one of the things that our children struggle with, especially now in this digital age where they don't have the interactions and the connections that we used to have growing up, is how they need to respond emotionally or behaviorally to certain situations, or even use that to help them when they're figuring out problems. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all in this evening. I felt like when you guys wanted to know information about the 5 senses, beyond that, how do we get our children not to only use their 5 senses for learning, but how do we get them to learn in a way that addresses the senses they have that we don't pay attention to? I felt like this training was exactly what you needed to know. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So let me go ahead and start the training. So on our agenda tonight, we're talking about the 5 senses, but we're talking about how children learn beyond those 5 senses. So we'll go through the traditional senses. We'll talk about how to combine those senses to make the learning experience even better. And we're going to talk about the intelligences that we don't really hear much about in school, but matter when it comes to how your children process information. And then we're going to talk about how you can use that information to help their learning, not only in the classroom, but what you can do to supplement their learning even at home. Just for those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Fabien. I am the founder and CEO of Bright IDEA Education. And Bright IDEA Education is a company that I established after being a military veteran, after being a teacher for almost 20 years, after I decided that I wanted to reach parents and children in a different way and on a bigger scale. And so Bright Idea was birthed out of that so that I could be able to work with parents and help in a different way. And now, because I do this, I'm able to help parents as well as agencies and companies, just like ELCHC. The Early Learning Coalition said, hey, we need to help our parents. Can you help us out? And that's how I'm here. So that's what Bright Idea is, and that's what Bright Idea does. We used to focus a lot of our efforts on children and parents that had special needs, but what I've found over the years is that what works for children and parents that have special needs also works for people who don't. And so we started spreading all of that across the board. Okay, so here's our magic question for tonight. Do you believe there are other ways to show intelligence besides IQ? Let me see your answers to that in the chat. Yes or no? Because in schools, most of the education surrounds what they can do intellectually, right, via the IQ, intellectual quotient. But there are other ways, I believe, and research shows that children can learn. So intelligence is a good place to start, but it's not the only place that you have to look when you're looking at children's abilities and what they can do. The reason I say research shows that children learn in other ways besides just the IQ, besides testing what they can revert back to us when we give them tests through a book or through information that we've taught, is because there was a researcher named Howard Gardner back in 1983, around 83, that started evaluating children. He's a psychologist who said, when I look at children and how they learn and how they develop, I see other areas that are not touched or targeted that are important to how they process information and how they develop as children. And some of those other areas that he found were linguistic intelligence, not only through mathematical, some spatial, music, body, interpersonal and intrapersonal, how we interact with each other, between each other, and what goes on with us internally. That's the intrapersonal. And then the naturalistic, associating what's going on in the world around us with how we're interpreting and understanding the world. So these are other areas that we don't typically test, but play a huge role in how children acquire information, okay? And when we're in school, usually when we're teaching students, we're teaching them through books, we're teaching them through words on a board. So we're using their sense of sight, we're using their sense of hearing, we're using the way that they talk, and maybe the things that they touch. But if you can layer the whole learning experience with all those different types of learning, it makes it easier for children to access the information. And an example I like to give with this is what I used to do when I was a preschool teacher. Children can conceptually understand an apple. They've eaten an apple before, or they're familiar with it because they've seen it a few throughout their life. But when we actually had a chapter where we talked about different fruits and vegetables and the food pyramid. And when I got to that chapter and teaching them about the different food types of foods, the proteins, the grains, the fruits, the vegetables, what I used to love to do was to bring in not only pictures, because a picture is a two-dimensional object, they can see it, they understand it, but a three-dimensional object that was the same type of food. So a picture of an apple, a toy that's an apple, like we would have on our refrigerator or in their little toy kits. If you buy the little kitchen sets for girls, sometimes you'll see an apple in there. Or sometimes the decorative fruit that we use on our tables, the wax fruit. So that's a different type of learning versus the two-dimensional. But what about when you bring that apple in and you bring it in all the different colors, you cut it, you let them smell it. That's a way to learn about the apple. You let them taste it. That's another way to experience the apple. You let them touch it. And when you can layer those body connections to the object you're teaching, it makes it easier for the child to understand the fullness of that topic. So that's why Gardner said we have to take into these other ways that children learn so that we can help them to become better learners and access more information that is around them. So tonight we're really going to focus on the bodily learning with the interpersonal, because that has to do with our social and our emotional learning, because learning is definitely tied to our emotions and our behaviors, and the naturalistic learning, how we interact with the world around us to learn about the things we need to know. Okay? All right. So we've gone through all 5 of the senses. Easily, you can talk about your sight, your hearing, your smell, your taste, and your touch. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Those are the 5 senses that we usually focus on. But how will we address those other senses? How do we combine senses to learn and address the emotional intelligence that is going on and the spatial awareness, the naturalistic awareness as we're going through the learning process? So why is this important for us? For one thing, you definitely want to do this because it helps students have a really comprehensive type of education. When you only focus on teaching them through words or through sight, they miss a lot of little nuances and information. But if you are able to give them this broader sense of information, they're able to learn better. You can enhance the outcomes. When I was younger, we used to sing songs to remember things. And I'm sure your children too. It used to amaze me how my kids could listen to a song and they would remember the words right away. I always struggled with that. But some children learn, if you can put it in a song, oh, they can do it. I've seen students do this with math. I've seen them do it with different rules for writing. I've seen students do it in all different kinds of ways. So if you can put the learning into music, you're addressing not only the sound, but if you put that music to movement, you're getting their body involved. And I know that I have seen my students sometimes sing the songs while they're doing the work or make the movements while they're doing the work because their body is helping them to remember what we taught them about the lesson. So that's one of the reasons why it is so important to layer the learning. It's also important because we talked about how students learn differently. Some students have disabilities. Some of you moms who participate in this have shared with us previously about your children having some intellectual impairments, some learning disabilities. Some of your children are nonverbal. And that doesn't mean that they can't learn. It just means the learning has to be adapted and make it accessible to them in the way that they can get the information. And sometimes that means putting it in motion versus saying it. If a child is nonverbal, they may not be able to tell you the answer, but they can demonstrate the answer. And that's another way of checking whether or not they're obtaining the information that is going out. So it's important to use multisensory learning and to learn beyond the 5 senses because it includes everybody in the learning process and makes it accessible to everyone. It's very holistic in the approach and it prepares them for the future. Children don't always sit at a desk and behind a chair and listen to a person lecturing or showing them things on the board. And you guys know this as adults. When you go into your job, a lot of the times you're putting what you know into practice. You're demonstrating it through a project that you're working on or through an assignment that you have to do for your job or a process that you need to follow to get something done at your job. And your children will have to do that when they become adults too. So start them with that process earlier on instead of having them sit and just get information that's being given to them, have them start demonstrating that information and putting it to work through their hands, through their bodies, through their emotions. Okay. All right. So some applications for this within the school system. So how do we apply this when we're teaching our children in schools? And some of these things you can actually talk with your child's teacher about. Intuitive development is important in this process too. And research says about 70% of what children learn is intuitive. And I want you to think about that from your own experience. Intuitive learning are the things that you learn that people can't teach you. It's like somehow you intrinsically know. It's not necessarily just reflexes, but it's just you extrapolating, taking the things that you know and using those things to help you figure out the things that you don't know. It's having that gut feeling or that, I don't know, that little je ne sais quoi that people have when they're learning about something and putting things together. Intuitive learning helps children, and the better they are at that, the better they can problem solve things, different situations at work. Sometimes you just know how something works. You can't explain it. That's what it is. So that's another type of learning, interoception learning that we have to make sure that our children, intuitive learning. And then the emotional intelligence that I was talking about, it's helping students connect their feelings and emotions with the process of acquiring information. That's important because one of the things that our children struggle with, especially now, in this digital age where they don't have the interactions and the connections that we used to have growing up, is how they need to respond emotionally or behaviorally to certain situations, or even use that to help them when they're figuring out problems. But if you can connect their emotions to their learning, they can learn to regulate their emotions. They can learn to balance out, and they can learn to empathize and sympathize with others in the learning process. And I'll tell you, this is a great skill to have, especially when it comes to literacy. So how does that work? Let me show you. When I would teach reading to my students, one of the things that I would have them do is to actively read. And we talked about active reading when we went through our session on literacy. But let me tell you now the connection to active reading and learning beyond the five senses. When your children are actively reading, they're not just seeing words on a page, calling them out and comprehending them, but they're connecting. So connecting with a story. When you look at a story and a character is doing something or made a decision about something, you can connect with that character. You can understand how they might be feeling in that situation. If you are a good reader and you're using this type of intelligence in the process of reading, you're connecting. Sometimes I can see people get so into books that, and sometimes it happens with movies. It happens more with movies, but when we're talking about literacy, they can get so into the story. And the reason they can get into the story like that is because they're putting themselves in the place of that character in that book, right? Another way that I would have them really use some of these other beyond the five senses skills is to evaluate. A character did something in the story that you may or may not agree about. Take a second, think about that. Would you do that? Or how would you do that differently? Or what would you have done in this case? Asking those questions, making sure they decide whether they agree or disagree with the situation, or they understand or say, no, I wouldn't have done that. Having them to evaluate what's happening in the story is a great way to help that emotional and that intuitive reading skill increase their comprehension. Some other things that I would have them do would be to predict. Okay, now that this has happened, you've made your decision about how you would have handled that situation. You've connected with this character. You understand why it was done. Now, what do you think is going to happen next? Make a prediction about what do you think is coming next. So that's another way that they can make sure that the learning is accessible to them and for them. You can have them summarize the story. Take everything that they've read and try and put that into a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs. And ask questions all along the way. Ask questions, get an understanding. This is a way to make sure that they're getting that intuitive and that emotional intelligence in the learning process. We also try to focus on the world around them. So when I talked about naturalistic learning, vestibular sense is another type of intelligence we should definitely be focusing on when we're teaching our children. When you're out with your child, we talked before in other sessions about how you can use the environments to help them learn about the world around them and make decisions in learning and put those together when they're in the classroom. So having them to go out, let's say if we teach them music through dance, teach them multiplication through dance, through music. One of the things that we do is we make sure that they are moving their bodies. You might see this in some younger children with songs like head, shoulder, knees, and toes. How did they learn those body parts? Through a song. How did they know where those body parts were? Because the song had motion. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. So they were learning about their body by using their body as the tool for learning. And then they began to see that in other people and recognize eyes for other people. And they started doing that very young. When you have other songs that they might have sang, Wheels on the Bus, that identifies the different parts of the bus. And it also helps them understand how the bus works. The wheels go round, which helps the bus to move. When we go over a bump, we go up and down. When the wipers wipe, they go left. So they were learning, but they were singing. Their bodies were getting involved, so it really stuck. Even some of the songs that you might have sang when you were younger, you probably still know those songs and sing those songs to your own children. It's because you learned those songs when you were so young, and you can't forget them. You just can't. Once they're in there, once you put your body in motion and put it to a song and learn it with your intelligence and your intuition, it's really hard to forget the information. Okay. So those are things we do when we're at school to help students get the learning that they need to for whatever subject it is. It could be for reading. We've talked about it in literacy. We've talked about it in math. It can be in social studies. I know right now my daughter is studying the Holocaust. And, learning about what happened during that time. And she has definitely been using emotional intelligence in the process of learning that. She's been extrapolating and comparing what life is like here now to what it might have been like then, and making the connections in that way. So what she's learning about the Holocaust is going to be hard for her to forget, because she's making all these connections in all these different ways. So it doesn't just apply to us when we're young learners. It applies as we get older too.
Hey there, it's Dr. Rolanda from Bright Idea, and I want to thank you so much for tuning into our video today. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far and you want more of where this came from, guess what? You're in luck. This is only the beginning, so make sure you're subscribed and make sure your notifications are turned on. That way, when we drop the next section of this video, you'll be one of the first to know. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for being a member of Bright Idea. Bye.